The John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. I'm Maggie Williams. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics here at Harvard University. Tonight, we will have a fascinating and I believe vitally important discussion of artificial intelligence from its origins to the enormous bearing on our future lives. Our panel of experts is uniquely qualified to explore this topic and enlighten those of us possessed with only human intelligence, and we are anxious to hear from them all. Our moderator, Sheila Jasanoff, is a global leader in the study of science and technology and their role in shaping law, politics, public policy, and governance. She is the Pforzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies here at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she also serves as director of the program on science, technology, and society. A prolific writer, she has published more than 100 articles and chapters and authored or edited 15 books, including her 2016 book, The Ethics of Invention, Technology, and the Human Future, considered to be a milestone in the field. It is now my great pleasure to turn our program over to Professor Sheila Jasanoff.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Good evening, and from my side also, welcome to the JFK Junior Forum this evening. I'm delighted to be moderating this evening's panel discussion on AI and bias, exploring the past, the present, and the future. Tonight's event builds on an earlier forum held on November 4th last year on preparing for the future of AI. These events have been designed and are co-hosted by the Future Society at the Harvard Kennedy School. This is one of our most active student organizations, and I'm proud to serve as one of its faculty advisors. In the crisis of knowledge and credibility that our societies are experiencing right now, it's heartening to see such a diverse cohort of students from HKS and beyond convening important conversations on the intersection between science, technology, and society. I'm aware just how much work goes into making such conversations possible, so I thank all of you for your work and hope very much that you will keep it going. The way the evening has been planned, as you heard, is that we will first have about 40 minutes of conversation here on stage with our distinguished panelists. I'll introduce them briefly in a moment. We'll then open up to Q&A with the audience for about 25 minutes further. So let me take this opportunity also to inform you that the Future Society, the organizer of this event, is building on tonight's event to launch an online consultation on the governance of artificial intelligence. Run on a civic technology platform over the next 12 months, this public debate will be open to everyone and will seek to involve citizens, experts, and practitioners to understand better the dynamics of the rise of AI, its consequences, and how to govern this revolution. To the audience tonight and to all those watching from home, here and abroad, please join the conversation and post your questions and comments. The link to the debate can be found on tonight's event webpage, and it should also appear on the big screen above me, which you can see better than I can. On that note, let me now introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. Iris Bohnet is a professor of public policy here at HKS and a behavioral economist. Her work combines insights from economics and psychology to improve decision-making in organizations and society, often with a gendered or cross-cultural perspective. Her most recent book is entitled, What Works? Gender Equality by Design. At HKS, Iris is also director of the Women and Public Policy Program and the co-chair of the Behavioral Insights Group. Cynthia Dwork, our second panelist, very recently joined the Harvard faculty as the Gordon McKay Professor of Computer Science at the Harvard Paulson School of Engineering. She's also a Radcliffe Alumnae Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Her work uses theoretical computer science to place societal problems on a firm mathematical foundation. Cynthia is an inventor and a pioneer in the field of cryptography and privacy-enhancing technologies. She's been working on how to address the fact that data algorithms and systems have biases embedded within them, reflecting designers' explicit and implicit choices, historical biases, and societal priorities. Alex Pentland, or Sandy as he's known, is the Toshiba Professor at MIT. He's also Professor of Media, Arts, and Sciences, a globally recognized computer and data scientist, inventor, pioneer, and entrepreneur. Sandy helped create and direct the MIT Media Lab. There, he leads the Human Dynamics Research Group and the Connection Science Initiative. As with our other two panelists, it's difficult to summarize Sandy's contributions and achievements, but he has done primary pioneering work on the governance of big data and artificial intelligence and the challenges they pose in terms of privacy. His most recent book is entitled Social Physics. So with that, let me try to begin a conversation that draws our panelists together, and I think that among them they will address and question certain aspects of conventional wisdom that people may have brought into this room with them. So the word bias in the title of today's forum is often thought to be a property of human beings. Human beings are biased, and it's also often presumed that biases are leans away from some alleged ideal center, and therefore they can be corrected, they can be put back, not like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It's also often assumed that experts are not biased. It's only the ignorant who don't know the true facts who are biased. And continuing on that expert line, it's also presumed that machines are less biased than people are. And if we could only substitute the perfection of the mathematical machine for the faulty or flawed human, we would be in a better place and with less bias to deal with. So as against those kinds of presumptions, I think all of our speakers will have very interesting contributions to make, and I'd like to begin with Iris and your views about social biases. So how do cognitive biases, which you've written so much about gender and race, enter into human decision-making, and how do they manifest themselves in institutions, in the institutions of justice, or in the institutions of education or health, in all of these kinds of places?
So first of all, Sheila, I definitely fall into the camp of people who think that we're all biased. So this might not come as a surprise to anyone in this room, but yes, we are sexist, and yes, we are racist, and yes, we're many more things that none of us wants to be. I think there's enough science now to prove that that's in fact true. I do not fall into the camp who thinks that experts are less biased than other people, but I very much fall into camp arguing that seeing is believing. So if we don't see, for example, women in leadership positions, or we don't see many male nurses, we don't naturally associate those jobs with women or men respectively, and therefore don't give them an equal opportunity. And that's what much of my work has been kind of up against. And that's why I also fall into the category of people who is actually quite optimistic about the potential of the machine to help us overcome some of these human biases. There's quite a bit of evidence suggesting that it's extremely hard to de-bias our minds, and that it might actually be more promising to go into our organizations, into our environments, and redesign how we work, how we learn, and how we live. And maybe if I can end with just one example to illustrate the kind of things I'm thinking about. Imagine or remember when you last applied for school or for a job. Were you in any way concerned about your demographic characteristics? Were you concerned that maybe the school or the university or the employer will treat you differently based on any of the characteristics that you have, not just demographic characteristics? So one intervention that we've been studying is blinding resumes, blinding CVs, taking off the names where people come from, sometimes even where people went to school, and seeing whether employers, in this particular instance then, would actually focus more on what the candidate has to offer rather than what the candidate looks like. And that's, in fact, the case. So blinding taking of names is one way to make it easier for our biased minds to get things right.
Thank you, Iris. Just one very quick follow-up. A lot of your work has been based on experimental studies of the way biases work out. Do you see any danger of expertise bias in the ways in which these experiments are designed? Do you see omissions or, biases in the minds of the experts entering into the very data that we collect on biases?
Surely any research method is fraught with the kinds of interests that a kind of a researcher brings to the question. And where you, for example, run your experiments. What I do like about the experimental method is that it allows us to establish causality very cleanly. So in many ways, social scientists, for those of you who don't know, social scientists in recent, I'd say about 20 years, have started to adopt a methodology that has been prevalent in psychology, of course, in the laboratory, but primarily also in the natural sciences. So now we learn from the natural sciences and give some people the treatment and other people the placebo, and then we measure what difference does the treatment make. And that's quite literally how we study, for example, the blinding of CVs, that we blind some CVs, we don't blind some other CVs, or we run the same CV through the blinding mechanism and the non-blinded mechanism, and then we see what kind of decisions come out of that. I don't know I would call this a bias, but it is, of course, the research question that is very specific to what I'm interested in. And one of the issues, again, I don't think it's necessarily a bias, but one of the issues that we have to be aware of when we run these kinds of experiments is that one of their big promises is internal validity, meaning we can really control how people react to the different medicine compared to the treatment, to the control group. But I can't necessarily easily generalize from having run an experiment in Australia and what it will mean in Guatemala for hiring in Guatemala or what it means for hiring in Kenya. So there's definitely limitations to the methodology, but I think every methodology has some advantages and some disadvantages.
Thanks so much. That's a lovely segue. You've been studying human systems, and Cynthia, you do mathematics and algorithms, and certainly people feel that if humans are congenitally predisposed to having certain kinds of biases, algorithms might sort things out. So I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about whether terms like fairness and unfairness have any relevance to thinking about algorithms, and whether algorithms can compensate for some of the kinds of structured deficiencies in the way our minds work that Iris has been focusing on.
So before I quite get to that, I actually have a favorite example of algorithms that exhibit a kind of bias. So the medical resident matching program matches medical students with residency programs at hospitals. And each person in each group lists their preferences. So the student lists gives an order on which programs he or she would most like to be in, descending order. And these lists are then combined to come up with a match. Now, the matching algorithm is a well-known one. It's called the stable matching algorithm. And it is known that it can be run in a way that is either optimal for the hospitals or optimal for the medical students, but not both. And prior to 1977, it was always run to be hospital optimal. And then in 1977, there was a reevaluation because there was a concern that somehow this was unfair to the students. And they actually changed how the program is run. So this is an example of an algorithm that has a bias, and the person who is running the algorithm can choose which direction the bias will go in. So there's a human choice, but there's also something that's sort of fundamentally biased. So the fact that it is an algorithm doesn't make it fair. Now, when we get into more modern concerns like AI and learning from data and so on, there's always the worry that what is learned is, in fact, simply the bias that's embedded in the data already. And like Iris, I am optimistic that this can be addressed. But the fact that something is an algorithm does not mean that it's behaving in a fair way.
Thank you. Sandy, talk about learning in relation to algorithms. I mean, so it's not just algorithms representing a set of patterns, but we in the sort of lay world consuming AI have started picking up terminology like deep learning and explain to us a little bit both what that is and whether there is a way in which, even if algorithms start with some of the kinds of problems that Cynthia is talking about, their dynamic evolution, especially as data get fed into them, can alter things for the better, or whether there are exacerbating tendencies there as well.
So let me start by providing just a little background. So a couple of years ago, I helped the UN Secretary General hammer out what sort of data and AI would be in the Sustainable Development Goals. And because the observation is unless you know what progress is, you can't know what programs are working and where you stand, and you don't know how your money's being spent and so forth. So the Sustainable Development Goals include almost 170 measurements that are supposed to be made by national statistical offices all over the world, who are in a bit of a tizzy because they have no idea how to do these things, okay? So we are funded by the French government and the Colombian government with cooperation of the Senegalese government to be able to set up pilots where we will take private data from telcos, banks, other sort of companies, as well as government data, to be able to have more transparency into the state of the country, with the idea that algorithms, policies can be more data informed to run things better. So I regard that as good, except that we have all these possibilities of doing horrible things. So one of the key elements in this is called open algorithms, is that the algorithms are continually vetted and re-vetted by all the stakeholders in the system. Governments, NGOs, private companies, other sorts of experts, things like that, to be able to ask, is this endangering personal data? Taking a tip from Professor Dwork in here. Does it have data that is sensitive in a way that is likely to be abused? An example of that are ethnic boundaries. And so on and so forth. And the trouble, the benefit is that you could have reliable, more objective governance based on more consensual, agreed upon data. The bad thing is you could have hidden biases and all sorts of other bad things. So the humans are in this loop to try and debate this and make sure that we're doing the right thing, and we regard it as a work in progress. To aid that, we've built a variety of tools to help detect biases. So while AI and machine learning things are often far too complicated to understand as a mere human, to know exactly what it is they're doing, one can get a sense of whether they're biased or how much they're biased, because almost everything is at least a little biased, by some fairly simple mathematical operations that take the decisions that are being made and compare them to sensitive variables like gender or race. And you ask, how much does this decision depend on these variables? And the question is not, are they biased in that way or not, but is this progress over the current situation? Because all of our systems are biased in all sorts of ways today. And what we want to do is make them biased only in ways that we all agree on. So for instance, we have affirmative action in some places. We want to be biased in certain ways to correct historical ills. So we've built tools to be able to give insight into the actual decisions. And the loop there is that you can't detect bias in decisions unless you have data about what's being decided and the variables that went into that. So you have to know gender, race, age, things like that, and whether they went to prison or not, just as an example of one that's often talked about. And only when you have that sort of data can you begin to have an informed discussion about the decision algorithms that you're applying being good ones or bad ones. Now, this is not a solution, it's not the silver bullet, but it's a framework for deciding how to have better policy and instantiating that into the algorithms that make up AI so that you can get more regular performance and monitor it.
So just a quick follow-up on that. I mean, you've placed a lot of importance on data being able to make things transparent for governance purposes. Do you have a concrete example you could share with us about maybe a place where the kind of work you were doing on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, helped pinpoint or put some kind of markers around a place where either the data gathering was flawed or was not happening and people began to change their behaviors accordingly? Have you seen something like that happen?
So for instance, it was 5 years ago now, we did a sort of dry run in Côte d'Ivoire. And we looked at markers like amount of money that people spent in each neighborhood on telephone, amount of mobility that they had, because these are indicators of, for instance, poverty, and also infectious disease propagates by people moving. And what we discovered by looking at that sort of neighborhood by neighborhood data is the government policies did not allocate enough support to some of the poorest neighborhoods, nor did the transportation systems service some of the poorest neighborhoods, nor did the planning for electrification address some of the problems. So it's sort of simple problems.
I'm tempted to ask you whether if you had just gone and talked to a person on the street in those places, they wouldn't have said those things anyway.
Well, they would have said all sorts of things. So you could have gotten answers from all sorts of people. And if you ask the experts, they probably worked for the electric company or the health ministry or something like that. So it's useful to have at least some base data where you know the provenance of the data, and you can make arguments about whether it's objective, correct, biased. It just makes the discussion much more fact-based. And in some cases, like for instance for transportation, it was very clear people didn't know, the transportation company didn't know where people lived and where people worked. They just had bus lines that were, where somebody said to put them. They went and talked to some people, and they got it wrong. And as a result, there were an awful lot of people who spent a lot of extra time burning a lot of gasoline to try and get to work.
So Cynthia, some of this discussion is about, it hasn't been said explicitly, but it's partly about how societies learn. So over the years, we've learned to see some of these unseen biases that Iris is talking about, and we've learned to correct for some of them. And Sandy's talking about how data can get people to be more factually aware of things. I wonder if you could talk to us about the ways in which machines learn and how machine learning can complement human learning, societal learning, in ways that have to do with bias and its elimination.
So I really, really wish I knew the answer to that question. It's a great question. Let me just try to clue you in a little bit about how I try to think about some of these things. So Sandy mentioned the question of whether certain decisions depended on a sensitive variable. And the general argument is they shouldn't depend on the sense, people sense, they believe decisions should not depend on these sensitive variables, and maybe it's even best if the decider not know what the value is of these sensitive variables. And that I don't believe. I don't believe it mathematically. Maybe in practice with human decision makers, that's something you need to do. But let me just give a really trivial, artificial example. Suppose you have a minority group in which the very bright students are steered toward math. And in the majority group, the bright students are steered toward finance. And the majority is a substantial majority. The minority is very tiny. So now you'd like to build a quick and dirty classifier to find bright students to try to recruit to your summer program. What do? Well, the obvious thing to do is, if you're not going to look at the minority status, the obvious thing to do is to look for students who study finance. But not only is it unfair to the bright students in the minority group who've been studying math, but it's also of reduced utility. You're not finding some of these gems. So it may be that the best thing mathematically is to pay close attention to these variables, but you have to have a sort of a cross-cultural awareness. You have to understand that for the purpose of finding bright students, a minority student who studies math should be looked at as similar to a majority student who studies finance. And I think that, that's just a very simple example, but the general question of how sensitive attributes can affect can be sort of holographically embedded into a lot of other information about us actually, it's not a question, it's just well known. Being a woman will change many, many things in your list of attributes versus being a man. It doesn't even make sense to say, what if this were the same person with opposite sex? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, that's why we set this open algorithm setup as a discussion rather than having a fixed rule.
Oh, I'm not criticizing what you're doing. I'm just saying that it's
not clear what you do unless you
Absolutely,
examine it.
absolutely.
Could you just explain, maybe in baby mathematical terms, what the difference is between a fixed rule and an open algorithm? So we can
a fixed rule and an open algorithm? No, I cannot. I've never heard of open algorithms before tonight.
Oh, well,
Sandy?
Open algorithm is one that you can examine and debate. That's all. It's just simply a word that
one can examine and debate if one is.
I think she gave a great example.
Yeah.
Right? You might think that some rule is a good one, but upon examination, you might discover that it's not. But your perspective might not reveal that. It might be somebody else's perspective that would reveal that, which means you need a discussion about.
I'm curious about who the we's and you's and they's are in this conversation. Is it people who understand the algorithms, or is it the other people out there? And I wonder, Iris, one could read the kind of thing that Cynthia was just describing in an extremely benign way if one thinks that social utility ought to be improved by picking out people and attaching them to the kinds of abilities they really have, and social disutilities are eliminated and so forth. But one could also read it in a more Orwellian way and think that this is an opening ground for something that's more like engineering and social engineering. So I wonder what you think about the sort of companionship that we're building with AI in terms of whether it can go too far towards control, towards ethical problems in the work that you do.
Yeah. So I'm going to try to actually simplify your question a little bit and answer in a simple way, and then explain to you, give you an example of why I think that might actually be a helpful framework. So when I teach decision making, I typically distinguish between defining the goals where we want to go, and then choosing the tools to get from A to B. I think as a decision scientist, I have very little to offer on the goals. Society has to define the goals, where it wants to go, has to define, in that sense, the utility, the end goal, the social utility, how we want to define what we're trying, to do here. And that could be Kantian, could be, some other definition of the utility. And I think I have actually relatively little to contribute. But then, once we know that we want to get to B rather than to C or D, I think the tools that we talk about here on stage today actually have a ton to contribute. How can you best get from A to B if you want to get to B? And let me give you an example which kind of is also going to show how this can be complicated. So let me just, a thought experiment. So when I ask you to think about the likely cause of death in the United States, and I ask you, is it more likely that somebody will die from homicide or from suicide, or from a shark attack, or from a falling airplane part, many people would say, oh, sharks are important compared to airplane parts, and homicide might be more important compared to suicide. Of course, this is not true. You're more likely to die from a falling airplane part than from a shark, and we're more likely to die from suicide rather than homicide. We call this the availability bias. So some pieces of information are just more salient, more present because of the media, because sharks are very kind of imaginable, what a shark looks like, a falling airplane part, hard to imagine what that might look like. So it's a crazy example, but availability bias is very present. It's also present in people when they evaluate risks. And so one question, this now goes back to my earlier point, one question is, so how should we spend our money when we try to do something about the risks that we face every day? So how much money should we spend thinking about sharks compared to fixing airplanes? Or going to a more concrete example, building safer cars or highways compared to building safer airplanes or airports. So most people are more concerned about airplanes, as you know, and less concerned about cars when we know that, of course, cars are much more dangerous than airplanes. And that's where now this whole question of, so how are we going to judge this as society? And then the economist in me, of course, would want to argue, well, we have to do some sort of cost-benefit analysis. I mean, money is scarce. I mean, we already know we spend a ton developing certain drugs for certain illnesses because, for example, on cancer, because everyone is very concerned about cancer. But there's other illnesses which actually are more prevalent and we spend much less money on. So as an economist, I would say, well, we have to think about the actual risk. And, I'm, of course, on thin ground here, but we kind of have to try to the best of our ability, kind of get some statistics around how likely is it that somebody is going to die from a shark attack as compared to a falling airplane part. And that should, in fact, inform our decision making. That should, in fact, and I'm not going to make a value judgment, that should, in fact, make our policy inform our policy choices. Now, having said this, of course, is not how we spend our money. Right? It is not how we spend our money because politicians need to be reelected. So we will care about what people think. And it's a very hard question for me also personally to say, is that really wrong? If people are so concerned about sharks, maybe we have to spend a ton of money on sharks rather than on airplane parts. I'm choosing this as a non-sensitive topic, as you can tell. So I think that's the question, right? It's people's feelings, which we know often are biased, have to do with personal experience, with what's salient, what the media tells us about. And then these are the people who vote for policymakers, and policymakers kind of have to care about that. And there's definitely some argument in me too. So I'm Swiss, I come from a direct democracy. There's some argument in me absolutely that says, have to go back to the people, have to ask them, what do you really care about? And that's what the policies have to be built on. And then I have this dual identity. Then there is the economist or the statistician in me who says, well, but isn't there some way to measure risk and likelihood that something bad will happen? And given that money is scarce, shouldn't we actually pay attention to that and spend money on where the returns are higher or where the risks are higher? So, a personal dilemma, I can't give you an answer. I think both have valid arguments, but you can tell I'm leaning towards doing something about, for example, the availability bias. And kind of even though people care more about sharks than about airplane parts, I would argue we probably have to spend more money on airplane parts rather than on sharks.
Well, sharks and airplane parts, I'm sure that you carry away the images of those. But in Iris's account of politics, there's a sense that the passions of the moment tend to override the objectivity of measurement sometimes, and that we might worry about that. But we've also seen that passions of the moment can drive people to produce data that actually compel action, and we've seen it historically in American history in attempts to get the plight of previously uncounted people counted. We see it very recently in the measurements of that have fueled the Black Lives Matter movement, where just certain kinds of police-inflicted deaths were not being counted, and a newspaper like The Guardian set up a counting system. So I wonder whether, so those are places where politics has begun to generate data in a sense. I wonder whether you can say, Sandy, based on your work, about whether AI or data systems themselves can be configured in ways that compensate for the holes in the data and that actually encourage us to use our collective intelligence more to report and become more intelligent data-producing entities and not just consuming entities.
Well, I think what she just said is points to the fact that these are complicated problems that involve essentially people becoming very literate about the situation and reaching an understanding. It took us probably a century to become comfortable with the census after it began.
The Germans did away with their census at a certain point. The Canadians were going to do away with it.
Because it was inconvenient, right?
Yes.
Right. See, so even simple things are sometimes difficult. I think it is possible. We do that implicitly in some places, and perhaps those are green shoots. For instance, when you watch a weather report now, they show you lots of different predictions, and that gives you a sense of the range of possibilities. That's actually a very sophisticated thing that they're doing there, with incredible amounts of data and supercomputers and so forth. But the average person actually understands that, oh, the hurricane could go this way, or this way, but most likely it's going to go this way. And so there's a certain sense in which the average person watching that now is better informed about this gigabytes and gigabytes of very complicated data, and perhaps things like that are a model. In other words, the ability to go and show with these assumptions and these things that we believe to be true today, what's likely to be the next step, to be able to predict things, and to show the family of predictions, not just one, like, believe me, this is it, but to be able to show the range of things. Because what that does is that provokes a discussion about what works, what doesn't work. It gets people to understand the process. And in the end, for me, it's people having a qualitative understanding of these facts and how to use them that is the thing that will make society actually work better, not the algorithms and stuff like that.
Well, I'm tempted to continue this further because I asked whether there's something that the data can do to set loose data imagination in citizens, and your answer was about making citizens better consumers of a range of things, which is not quite the same thing. But maybe we can get to some of these kinds of questions in questions from the audience. So